Motivation is not a virtue, it is a neurological scam. We must categorize it correctly. Motivation is an endocrinological fiction, a transient spike in dopaminergic activity designed by evolution to prompt primitive apes to forage for caloric density. It is not an operational strategy for a functional adult. It is a biological reflex, fragile and entirely reliant on external stimuli. Yet, modern culture has elevated this biochemical hiccup into a prerequisite for action. This is the cognitive pathology of the contemporary era. Waiting to feel inspired or motivated before executing a necessary task is the defining diagnostic criteria of behavioral failure. It is the exact psychological profile of a chemical dependent. You are conditioning your basal ganglia to require a biochemical high before initiating friction. If you require a surge of dopamine to clean your environment, build your enterprise, or structure your physical health, you are not an ambitious visionary, you are a biological junkie waiting for a fix. You are holding your own existence hostage to the arbitrary and chaotic fluctuations of your endocrine system. This is an infantile entitlement masking itself as an emotional necessity. Let us precisely dissect the clinical divergence between a feeling and a duty. A feeling is merely somatic feedback. It is an involuntary biological response to immediate environmental inputs, ambient temperature, blood glucose levels, circadian fatigue, or the cheap, engineered hyperstimuli of a glowing digital screen. Feelings are inherently reactive, short-sighted, and violently unstable. They do not possess intellect, they possess immediate urgency. To subordinate your life's trajectory to how you feel in any given hour is to surrender executive control to a hyperactive toddler. Duty, conversely, is an execution of the prefrontal cortex. It is the conscious, calculated cognitive override of biological resistance. Duty recognizes that the acute discomfort of the present is a mandatory transaction for the architectural stability of the future. It is the Stoic realization that your biological desire to remain stationary, comfortable, and sedated is entirely irrelevant to the objective reality of what must be done. The insidious neurological trap of motivation is that it masquerades as actionable energy, but it is actually a biological debt. When the dopamine spike crashes, and the metabolic half-life of dopamine dictates that it will crash with brutal rapidity, you are left in a neurochemical deficit. If your behavioral conditioning relies exclusively on this spike, the absence of it completely paralyzes your output. You narcissistically label this paralysis, burnout, depression, or lack of direction. It is none of these. It is simply dopamine withdrawal. Assimilate this clinical reality: your motivation is designed to betray you. It is biologically programmed to evaporate the precise moment the novelty of an action dissipates and friction is introduced. Your nervous system is structurally designed to seek the path of least resistance, conserving caloric energy for non-existent famines. Therefore, the absence of the desire to work is not a profound psychological signal to pause, it is simply the baseline mammalian default. Stop waiting for a feeling. You are anticipating a biological miracle that evolution refuses to provide. Unflinching execution in the total absence of desire is the sole diagnostic metric of actualized psychological maturity. Motivation is a neurochemical scam. It is a transient dopamine spike, an evolutionary bribe designed to compel primitive humans to gather berries or chase game. It is inherently unstable. Relying on motivation to build a life of substance is the psychological equivalent of building a fortress on wet sand. When the dopamine dissipates, and it always will, you are left with the reality of friction. This is where discipline begins, not as a mystical virtue or a divine emotional state, but as a brutal, mechanical process of forced neural rewiring. To understand discipline, you must understand the architecture of your own weakness. Deep within the temporal lobe lies the amygdala, the primitive emotional processing center. The amygdala prioritizes immediate survival and absolute comfort. It despises friction. It interprets the boredom of deep work, the physical pain of exertion, and the denial of instant gratification as acute threats to homeostasis. When you feel the overwhelming urge to quit, you are not experiencing a profound personal crisis, you are merely listening to the panicked shrieking of an ancient, mammalian structure terrified of caloric expenditure. Discipline is the systematic execution of a neurological override. It is the act of weaponizing your prefrontal cortex, the evolutionary pinnacle of the brain responsible for logic, executive function, and long-term projection, against the hysterical demands of the amygdala. This is a hostile takeover. Every time you force yourself to execute a task when you are profoundly unmotivated, exhausted, or bored, you are not just checking a box. You are physically thickening the myelin sheath around the axons connecting the prefrontal cortex to the limbic system, enhancing the top-down inhibition of impulsive behavior. You are building a biological infrastructure of compliance. This process is agonizing by design. Neuroplasticity requires resistance. If the action does not induce a spike of psychological friction, it is not rewiring the brain, it is merely maintaining the existing, comfortable circuitry. The pain and the profound resistance you feel when attempting to focus are not signals to stop. They are the physiological friction of weakness leaving the nervous system. The anterior midcingulate cortex, a brain region uniquely associated with willpower, only grows when you force yourself to do exactly what you do not want to do. When you surrender to comfort, this region atrophies. Your inability to commit is a measurable neurological deficit caused by chronic capitulation to ease. Stop waiting for the right mood. The concept of feeling ready is a cognitive distortion. The prefrontal cortex does not require a specific emotional state to issue a command to your motor cortex. You can be paralyzed by anxiety, devoid of joy, and fundamentally opposed to the task at hand, and you can still execute. Your limbs still function. The weights can still be lifted. The separation of execution from emotional validation is the definitive hallmark of psychological maturity. Your emotional state is entirely irrelevant to the mechanics of action. You simply have to command the meat machine to move, aggressively crushing the primitive urges beneath the cold, unyielding weight of rational intent. The industrialization of self-help is not an apparatus of human elevation, it is a meticulously engineered behavioral sink. We must clinicalize our understanding of what you consume when you watch motivational content. You are not acquiring knowledge. You are subjecting your prefrontal cortex to a synthetic hyperstimulus designed to hijack your dopaminergic reward system. This is the commodification of inspiration, the mass production of motivational porn. From a neurological standpoint, the primitive brain is remarkably susceptible to simulation. When you watch a heavily edited video of a charismatic figure shouting about discipline, backed by a Hans Zimmer crescendo, your brain cannot distinguish between the aesthetic representation of triumph and the physical, caloric exertion of actual triumph. You experience a massive neurochemical spike. Dopamine floods your synapses. You feel the profound, intoxicating satiety of having conquered a mountain, yet your physical reality is that you are staring blankly at a piece of glass in a dark room. This is not an accident of the algorithm, it is the core architecture of the capitalist matrix. The system profits off a devastating cognitive illusion, the conflation of consumption with execution. You are conditioned to believe that purchasing a planner, bookmarking a workout routine, or absorbing a podcast is mathematically equivalent to doing the work. It is not. It is an evolutionary glitch. You are being spoon-fed empty neurochemical calories, sedating your natural drive to build. Diagnose the business model of the guru. The commercial viability of the motivation industry relies entirely on your chronic, recurring failure. If a motivational seminar actually cured your lethargy, you would never return. The industry demands perpetual deficiency. They manufacture emotional volatility, artificially inflating your state so that the inevitable regression to your baseline feels like a physiological crash. In that crash, you are primed to consume their next video, their next course, their next synthetic high. A permanently cured patient is a dead revenue stream. Here is the stark psychological reality: a mind tethered to inspiration is a mind permanently relegated to the consumer class. To wait for motivation is to surrender your behavioral agency to external emotional weather that is deliberately manufactured by algorithms to keep you scrolling. A creator operates on cold, algorithmic behavioral loops, executing tasks utterly independent of their temporary neurochemical state. A consumer requires a charismatic surrogate to aggressively alter their emotional state before they can execute a single basic function. As long as you require motivation to act, you are not a sovereign individual, you are a highly predictable, easily manipulated variable in a corporate economic equation. You do not need a spark. You need a system. Let us diagnose the specific pathology underlying the modern mind's obsession with inspiration. To wait for motivation before taking action is not merely a behavioral deficit, it is a profound cognitive distortion. It is the arrogant, unspoken assumption of immortality. You operate under the obscene delusion that your time is infinite, that you possess the limitless luxury to pause and wait for the precise neurochemical alignment before engaging with reality. I present to you the ultimate clinical intervention, memento mori. Remember that you are dying. You are a decaying biological mechanism, and your temporal capital is bleeding out into the void with every exhalation. Waiting to feel inspired before executing your mandate is the supreme arrogance of an organism that has entirely repressed the reality of its own impending termination. Death is an absolute, unavoidable biological guarantee, yet you squander your sharply limited hours negotiating with your primitive limbic system for a temporary burst of enthusiasm. It is not just inefficient, it is intellectually offensive. The Stoic philosophers grasped a psychological absolute that modern therapy often buries beneath endless emotional coddling: the mandatory decoupling of action from effect. The execution of your duty requires zero joy, zero excitement, and absolutely no internal fulfillment. Duty is a cold, objective requirement, entirely independent of your fluctuating internal weather. You have been systematically conditioned to believe that you must enjoy the process, that passion is a prerequisite for labor. This is a manufactured neuromyth designed to keep weak minds paralyzed. Examine the paradigm of Marcus Aurelius. The emperor did not drag himself from his bed in the freezing dawn to command the Roman legions, manage devastating plagues, and stabilize an empire because his dopamine receptors were perfectly optimized. He did not wake up feeling motivated to face the crushing weight of global leadership. He rose because the duty existed. He viewed his obligations through the clinical, unyielding lens of absolute necessity. The internal resistance he felt was categorized as irrelevant data. This is the essence of the Stoic execution. You must systematically train your prefrontal cortex to govern your actions entirely in the absence of positive emotion. When you begin your work, your nervous system will inevitably rebel. Your brain, biologically wired to conserve caloric energy, will manufacture profound lethargy, anxiety, and intense aversion. Your body will scream for the effortless comfort of your familiar dopamine loops. Your mind will generate 1,000 perfectly logical rationalizations to quit. You must observe this internal psychological tantrum clinically, and then completely override it. The fact that you despise the task is merely neurochemical noise. Acknowledge the friction, categorize it as a predictable physiological response to stress, and execute the behavior regardless. Your feelings are not the arbiters of your existence, your actions are. Motivation is an unreliable, treacherous companion. True power lies in the clinical execution of duty, enforced precisely when you hate it most. Move forward, entirely indifferent to your own psychological resistance. Motivation is not a virtue, it is a neurological vulnerability. If your capacity to execute a task relies upon a transient surge of dopamine and adrenaline, you are nothing more than a biological puppet waiting for your endocrine system to pull the strings. The architects of the modern economy understand this fatal flaw. They profit from your erratic neurochemistry, convincing you that an elevated emotional state is the prerequisite for meaningful action. To reclaim your autonomy, you must amputate this dependency entirely. You must voluntarily kill the part of your psyche that waits for the right mood. To survive the behavioral sink of this century, you must accept the absolute brutality of conditioning. You do not need a spark, you need a system. The path to unassailable power is paved with relentless, agonizing repetition. Repetition is not designed to be exciting. It is a mechanical process designed to thicken the myelin sheath around your neural pathways until conscious decision-making is entirely bypassed. You must become a cold monolith of execution. You build habits so rigid, so mercilessly ingrained, that the act of deviation becomes more painful than the act of compliance. The most terrifying individuals within any human hierarchy are those who have successfully severed the neurological link between emotion and action. When your output is no longer tethered to your affective state, you become fundamentally immune to manipulation. The algorithmic feeds cannot hijack your productivity because you no longer require their synthetic behavioral hooks to function. The system cannot sell you a cure for your lack of motivation because you refuse to recognize lack of motivation as a valid obstacle. You operate completely outside the spectrum of enthusiasm and despair. You act when you are ecstatic. You act when you are suicidal. The execution remains identical. To achieve this, you must learn to weaponize boredom. The weak are profoundly terrified of monotony. The moment their neuroreceptors drop below a baseline of hyperstimulation, they panic and flee into cheap digital pacifiers. But monotony is the crucible of extreme competence. You must redefine boredom not as a psychological punishment, but as an evolutionary privilege. It signifies a nervous system that is no longer erratic, a brain settled into the deep, dark rhythms of uninterrupted focus. No depressive episode or existential crisis can dismantle a mind that has embraced the void of routine. This is your final evolution. You are no longer participating in the frantic marketplace of human emotions. You are a biological machine, ruthlessly executing a predetermined algorithm of dominance. Let the masses wait indefinitely for inspiration. You will simply wake up, engage the protocol, and execute. You are untouchable, not because your fire burns brighter, but because your fire is completely irrelevant. The machine does not feel. The machine simply crushes.